Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve.
Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. We started this podcast to connect to Mad Men fans like us who pick up something new with every rewatch.
Be advised, this podcast will include spoilers, so we can talk about character arcs all the way through the final season.
We're breaking down each episode of Mad Men and posing some questions to listeners so we can get your insights. Let's get started with Mad Men, C to Z. Today we're talking about Episode 7, Season 1 of Mad Men, Red in the Face. This is an outstanding episode of Mad Men, and I'm not just saying this because it involves a chip and dip, although it does. If you watch this episode, I think it's a fair capture of the essence of what Mad Men is, whether you want more or you're out. It doesn't give us a good look at the Peggy or Joan storylines, but Peggy did get a great one the last episode, and we see a lot of Dawn, Roger, Betty, and Pete in their sweet spots, or awkward, vengeful, dark spots, as the case may be.
The episode opens with Dawn on the phone to Betty's psychiatrist.
We see Dawn continuing to be distrustful of psychiatry here and simultaneously concerned that Betty seems broken. He says, "She wasn't always like this." And again, the psychiatrist claims that Betty is like a child, which Dawn will use against her later. But Dawn, Pete, and Roger are all at least as childish as Betty, if not more, in my opinion.
I have the same vibe. It feels like the psychiatrist is not doing much justice to Betty's needs or situation. It seems dismissive and sexist to say she's acting like a child. He talks about her petty jealousies and her mentality.
Yes, this is the person in charge of her mental health.
Which again is hard to get my head around from a modern perspective, that the psychiatrist is telling Dawn the updates and giving this evaluation, which we're sure as viewers he's not providing to Betty.
When we move into the second scene, another one on the phone, we see Roger, and he's talking to his wife, Mona, and you can tell she cares about him because she's badgering him about his diet. And it is important to note that this episode starts and ends with Roger's health and the fact that he's aging. It's almost like incessant smoking and drinking aren't a great recipe for longevity.
Who knew? In the episode, we see Roger having vodka with milk, which is kind of a funny combination. In the office, Cooper stops by to mention that the Nixon team is stopping by. This seems to be something that Bert Cooper is most eager to land, to be part of the Nixon campaign in 1960.
I also notice when Roger's talking to his wife, he says, "Go on vacation and take the heiress," referencing his daughter, to, quote, "knock the scowl off her face." We'll see in a minute that he's just wanting time with Joan while his wife and daughter are out of town.
Bert also throws in a dig at Roger about his health, saying that he needs to smoke less, and it's a sign of weakness.
He has this story about Hitler gaining advantage over Neville Chamberlain by denying him cigarettes, and Roger answers, "All I can get from this story is that Hitler didn't smoke, and I do." He just keeps smoking and drinking his vodka-laden milk.
Yeah, I don't think Roger's at the point in life where he needs any advice on his health, or at least there's no advice that he's going to follow.
The scene moves quickly into a connection between Joan and her roommate, Carol. This is our first sighting of Kate Norby. You might recognize her from Big Love and Boston Public. We see a little bit of Joan setting boundaries with Roger. She's not letting him take her for granted. He's trying to convince her to go out with him, and she already has plans, and she's keeping those plans. And she seems a little miffed with him that he wants to take her for granted and just call her when he's available.
Yeah, Joan makes a point of saying that she needs some notice for these little outings with Roger. Roger seems discouraged and a little put out that Joan is denying him. It quickly switches to Roger inviting Dawn out.
We also notice Joan's roommate, Carol, giving Roger some peculiar looks, and that's going to make more sense and have a payoff later on, too. We get this funny little string of scenes leading up to where Roger asks, "What are you doing tonight?" And Peggy, sitting at her desk, answers. He's like, "What are you doing tonight?" And she's like, "Well, I'm going to do some work and then go home." And he's like, "Well, that sounds great, sweetheart." But I think he says, "I'll let you enjoy that one, honey, but I was talking to Donald here."
And in that brief check-in, we learn again that Peggy is still working on copy for Fred Rumson for the Belle Jolie lipstick campaign.
Both Pete and Dawn are giving Peggy unsolicited advice about not working too hard or too late. Pete says it's bad for your skin, and Dawn says, "I don't want you milking the dinner money, and I don't want you to have your head on your desk in the morning," meaning I need you to still be fresh and ready to be a good secretary while you're doing this copywriting on your own time.
And I think the writing there just shows us how, although Peggy's gotten this opportunity, it comes with strings attached and additional challenges over and above. So it doesn't displace any of her day job. She has to do it on top. And then you're getting pinged by your boss and the account man, Pete. Once again, their interest and comments to Peggy seem something other than supportive or good camaraderie.
And we're not even shocked by it at this point in the series. It just seems normal to us now. We're so immersed in it. There's a great moment where Pete tries to insert himself between Dawn and Roger making plans because Roger tried to get plans with Joan and that didn't work out. So then he's convinced Dawn to go out with him. Roger's saying to Dawn, "One drink, you owe me that." And Pete walks up and says, "Oh, did I miss something?" And you know he desperately wants to be included here. And Roger goes, "No, Dawn and I talk all the time when you're not around. In fact, we're going to do it right now." So he tries to keep his big, important claim. He says, "Oh, good night, boys." And Roger calls back, "Good night, Paul." And then he says to Dawn, "I love doing that. It's such a petty burn, but it's also kind of great."
It's a great shot at Pete. It makes it clear that there is something of an alliance between Roger and Dawn against Pete.
When Pete turns to Peggy, because he couldn't get any power with Dawn and Roger, so he'll take it over Peggy where he can, he seems really incredulous that she's doing writing on her own. So she says, "I'm working on copy for Belle Jolie." And he's like, "By yourself?" So he lies to her too. And he says, "If you want me to look at it, I look at it all the time for the fellas," he says. So he's presenting himself like an expert that he is not.
Again, Pete is the wannabe creative and the continual underestimating of Peggy.
So Dawn and Roger are out for a drink, and we're seeing Roger's jealousy of Dawn build here. He wanted time with Joan, and she wouldn't break her plans. And now he's up for meeting women at the bar, even though Dawn isn't. And they only have eyes for Dawn. Now Roger gets lonely, and he forces his way into a dinner invitation at Dawn's house. Remember that Roger is the boss because his father owned the business. So now Roger has power over Dawn, but it's not like it's anything he earned. Just like the women looking at Dawn, that's genetics, that's not effort. Now Roger's ego is wounded and he's got to flex some power and get what he wants when he wants it, not unlike Pete.
It does seem to be a strong theme of this episode. Roger's age, his sort of midlife crisis, and the ways he seeks to mollify himself, whether it's pursuing this affair with Joan, whether it's trying to make eyes with the women at the bar. He observes that there's this glow of pure youth, and clearly he has envy and desire for that. And then he mentions that something happens at 30 and someone puts out a light. It's ostensibly a comment about other women, but I think in this moment it's reflective of Roger's own fears and thoughts about himself. His light is going out and he can sense it.
That's a great point. He pressures Dawn, who at least calls Betty to give her a heads up. And I really like this scene. We always see Betty Draper so put together. But this is so real world. She's got a kid in her arms and she's smoking. She's got curlers in her hair. She's half dressed. And Sally is doing gymnastics in the hall. So this is her real life as she prepares for this event of Dawn coming home that is so picture perfect. And that's how we've seen her to this point. Everything is in chaos as he's calling her to say, "By the way, my boss is coming over for dinner."
I enjoyed the comedic value of the scene, but I think it's also a great moment in Betty's life to say that this is her life. She's at Dawn's beck and call. He springs a dinner guest on her. We're going to see later, when they're eating dinner, that there's not enough for her to have. So Dawn and Roger, of course, get it and not her. So I think, again, it's comedic, but it also serves the purpose of showing another source of dissatisfaction in her life. She's not in control. She doesn't get to do what she wants to do. She's in some ways a servant at the beck and call of her husband.
She says, "I don't even think I have any food to feed you." And he says, "Well, what do you do? Where's all that food you buy to put in that freezer I bought you?" And she's like, "It's frozen food. We didn't plan for this." And then it cuts immediately to the steak plate. And there are three of them. And she has the best line. So here's Roger eating her steak. And she has a salad. And he's like, "Are you sure you don't want any?" And she goes, "No, I'm a vegetarian sometimes." So he has completely upended her life and their plans for this dinner.
As the discussion continues, Roger and Betty talk about night swimming. They ask Dawn about whether he did night swimming or what he's done, and Dawn talks about swimming in a quarry. And here Roger says that the way Dawn drops his G's might have meant that he was raised on a farm. So we've got this allusion to Dawn's uncultured, unaffluent background and how it does poke its head out once in a while and gives little peeks. Even though Dawn doesn't provide any additional details to support it, he can't completely and successfully hide it 100%.
That is such an important moment, too, because Roger says that I always thought you might have been raised on a farm. And then he says, mockingly, someplace with a swimming hole. And he looks at him. And there's a moment where Dawn gives him a look, and it's a dangerous tension. And this whole scene, it feels like Roger is willing to invite Dawn into his friendship circle. So it's not like he's going to go out drinking with Pete or Harry or somebody. This isn't real friendship. It's more like an experiment on Roger's part and a chance for him to flex his power. It's obviously competitive. Roger's dig here about the speech patterns are chief among them. And Dawn does not have the power to say, no, we only have 2 steaks, or get out, or don't talk to me like that. He just has to sit there and take it.
The conversation then shifts to talking about the war. They talk a little bit about the saying, light 3 cigarettes on a single match. Roger talks about his father being in the trenches with the bayonet. It sort of comes around to Dawn doesn't talk about the war. This again fits the pattern for Dawn. He's secretive about his past, and this includes the war. So there's no tales of heroism or peril or adventure. It's another chapter that we know Dawn was in the Korean War, but we don't know anything about what he did there. Roger then rolls into talking about his father and being jealous about his dad with this dramatic bayonet story going over the top. As Roger talks about it, he then tails off and decides that he doesn't want to talk about it, probably remembering some of the horrors of the war and getting back to that very common trait among vets of World War II that they didn't want to think or discuss it too much because it brought back the bad memories. Although Roger does roll into a story from his particular service, which reveals that Roger was the commander of a naval vessel. So again, we see this privilege and education level of Roger. He was an officer in command of a vessel. And they talk about shooting down a Japanese reconnaissance plane and eventually coming across the wreckage in the water, but no sign of a body, just a destroyed plane sitting there floating. Dawn mentions that Roger received a medal for this action, and Roger acknowledges it, and then almost changes the subject, asking for a refill on his drink.
I have to say, I don't see anything Betty does that's inappropriate with Roger here. I see her being a good hostess, just the way she was when they had dinner with Mona. Dawn gives her a look when Roger says, "You're making me look bad in front of the lady." And she says, "Oh, that's impossible." But it does not seem like a beyond the pale kind of a comment. Dawn is a serial cheater, so it's not that it would be great for her to flirt with his boss, but the hypocrisy here is off the charts. I think she does probably like the attention of having somebody converse with her at dinner because we know Dawn doesn't really notice her very much. But I don't think at any point she's out of line here. Did you catch anything that you thought was a little bit shady or uncomfortable?
I really didn't. And similar to you, I'm left wondering, where's Don coming from with these sentiments? And on the one hand, I think he is thinking about his own infidelity and propensity to cheat. And I think that may be a source of insecurity, that if Betty was similarly disposed, she's highly attractive, she's in her prime, and she could attract and lure any man she chose to. So I wonder if he's got an insecurity on that front that's exacerbated by his knowledge of his own proclivities. And I also wondered if there was an element of him wanting to control her here. He doesn't want her flirting with Roger, but he also wants to control the interactions they're having and limit their relationship in a way that Betty's his property, no different than him calling her with short notice to say, we're going to host a guest and you need to cook meals for him. He wants her to behave the way he wants her to behave in the interactions during the meal. Just a big control play by Dawn.
I think it's particularly because the more Roger tries to exert influence and power over Dawn, Dawn chafes at that and feels the need to exert his influence over Betty during this dinner. Again, I do think that Betty is doing her best to meet Dawn's needs and expectations to be a good hostess. And all this matters, of course, because when Dawn gets up to refill Roger's drink, Roger makes a pass at her. He accuses Betty of, "You've been making eyes at me all night." I didn't see anything that struck me as so flirtatious. It's this terrible, terrible situation that she's in where she's had to give up her dinner. She's had to be polite to this guest all night. Now, suddenly, he is making a hugely inappropriate drunk pass at her in the kitchen while her husband is in the garage. There's not a good way to extricate herself.
Yeah, he physically grabs her. He's up close and in her space. He's giving her compliments, telling her that she smells nice. And Dawn is just out in the garage getting a drink, so he's coming back any second. Betty doesn't show any positive reception to it at all. She turns away. She tries to keep doing what she's doing in the kitchen. Roger knows he's on the clock, so as Dawn emerges back from the garage, he backs away. But it's very clear in the manner of Betty and the look on Roger's face, and then Dawn's look as he sees them in the kitchen there. He realizes full well that something's just occurred.
And Roger plays it off. He says, "Come on, you two, come out and wish me bon voyage. I was just saying what a lucky man you are. Beautiful children, enjoy it." Dawn doesn't say anything. After drinking all evening, Dawn's looking out the door at Roger getting ready to drive with a drink literally in his hand. Dawn calls out, "That's my car." And we hear Roger get in the right one and then squeal away. So that's some safe decision making there.
It's another one of those time capsule humors, I think, alluding to this era when drinking driving wasn't taken very seriously. Again, through modern eyes, it just seems insane that Roger's about to drive. Back inside the house, Dawn and Betty start speaking, and it's clear Dawn is furious with Betty. "What was that? You seem to be having a grand time. You made a fool of yourself."
I really thought he was going to be protective of her. And instead, he couldn't take out his frustration with Roger, so he takes it out on her. I really thought he owed her an apology, and instead he blames her for it.
Not just that, he physically grabs her arm, and it looks like he's ready to do violence to her. And Betty almost challenges him or provokes him and says, "Do you want to bounce me off the walls?" And it feels like she's calling him on that to say either you're going to do it or you're not. Dawn backs off and lets go. But I thought it was an aggressive, harsh response, justified harsh response from Betty to him. And she asks him, "Would it make you feel better?" Dawn comes back with the response, "Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a little girl," which again, I think is that allusion you said at the top of the broadcast to the conversation with the psychiatrist.
It's just such a rude parting shot. In Mad Men, the writing is so clever, I think, because human beings do take pieces of their lives from one context and translate it into others. So he's really taking advantage here of this information that the psychiatrist is giving him and feeding it to make himself feel better, like he's right and she's wrong and she's to blame. But to me, this whole evening seems really outrageous. And I was watching carefully to see, okay, is there any little piece that's justified? And I really can't find it. So if you're listening and you see anything, please let me know, because I was looking and I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I didn't see it either. And I'm like you, I was looking for it, but I saw nothing.
All right, now we are going to get into the stuff of legends. We go back to the office and we see the office guys coming into Pete Campbell's office. He says he's got a chip and dip. Now, this chip and dip, which helps give our podcast its name, this physical thing was actually a present that Matthew Weiner's parents received. And in the DVD commentary, Vincent Kartheiser says, it was like working with a baby on set. You only get them for 15 minutes or something, and you have to be really careful with it. He said when he was carrying around the box, there's no chip and dip inside that box. It had a special guardian, basically, that was looking after it. So it was only viewed when the lid came off the box and you got to see this actual real thing. And I have a poll question for our listeners on this point. Do you think a chip and dip is a great present, an okay present, or a terrible present? Where do you stand on the whole chip and dip gift thing, Steve?
I think a chip and dip is a pretty good present in 1960. And it's not a cheap chip and dip either.
Would you have kept it if you got two? Do you think you could sustain two chip and dips?
If I could exchange it for what Pete ends up exchanging it for, I do admit I'd probably take that route.
Well, we will get to that part here. When the guys are teasing Pete about doing an errand at lunch instead of going out drinking, he says, "I like doing things for her," meaning Trudy. So exchanging this second chip and dip that they've gotten, his chivalry seems to have reappeared a little bit, which he lost a bit earlier. They weren't speaking because of the whole boy's life, I want to be published, go to your ex and make it happen situation. And here he is again, trying to do right by Trudy, I think.
I like that interpretation. I think that's accurate.
We cut to the next scene where Roger comes into Don's office and he's bringing an expensive bottle of scotch, something for the golf bag. That's the good stuff, he says. Don says, "I take it you got home in one piece," referring to his drunk driving. This is this really awkward apology. Roger's just giving him money and evasion, basically. And Don doesn't have any power to reject it unless he wants to quit his job. So he's not effusive or friendly, but he also doesn't put up a fight here.
It really feels like Dawn doesn't want to accept the apology, and Roger gets the message. The apology is not accepted. Dawn's not happy about Roger crossing the line at his house. And Roger isn't willing to go any further in terms of directness to say the formal apology beyond just saying sometimes he has an unnatural sense of entitlement. He says, "Oh, Don, you're not making this easy." He's brought the fancy gift. Roger wants to be let off the hook, and he doesn't want to have to go the whole way. Don's not willing to do that, so they reach an impasse, and that's where it stops.
At some point, we've all parked in the wrong garage, Roger says. like that's a normal thing. What?
And Don thanks him for the bottle at that point, and then mentions Betty will want the glass back. So it's clear we're not fully mended up here, and that's going to come back to play a little later in the episode.
We cut to see Pete in line with only women at the return. So he's looking to exchange this chip and dip. And we get to see Shayna Rose as Rosemary. You might recognize her from Days of Our Lives and the Fresh Beat Band. And we also are going to see Teddy Sears as Matherton. So you would see him on Raising the Bar, Masters of Sex, Brilliant Minds, and The Flash.
It is rather comical to see Pete, the account man, in the lineup to make a return. Even just the drudgery of the return where they ask him for a receipt. He's repeatedly has to say it's a gift. He doesn't have a receipt. And then he bumps into a friend of the family, Matherton.
And he's not there to exchange a gift for his girlfriend or his wife. He's just there getting his racket restrung. And everything about this scene emphasizes Pete's emasculation. Even when he gets to the front of the line, it turns out that the bridal registry would be in the wife's name. And he says, why would they do that? And there's a woman in line who says, oh, my husband's in advertising. He'd much rather be drinking than here. And he says, oh, what's his name? He's not heard of him. And she's like, that's because you're here instead of going to lunch with the important people. So everything about Pete's presence there, starting with his own colleagues in his office, has taught him that he's not doing what's expected of him, even though he's trying to do a nice thing for his wife.
And I think Pete's very quick as a character to feel sorry for himself. So no good deed goes unpunished. And I think at this point, Pete is feeling exactly that. I've tried to do the right thing and I don't get anything for it. In fact, I have further embarrassments or, minor humiliations visited upon me.
I also find it really funny how he keeps explaining the chip and dip and what it's for. And earlier he goes into some recipe with like the onions and we got two. And he just keeps saying the same words over and over and it gets more and more hysterical. As he gets to the woman who's in charge of the registry specifically, you can see him trying to charm her. And you get the feeling he wants to prove that he can more than he has any actual interest in her. It's not like even that he needs the money from this exchange as much as he needs a win. It feels a lot like Roger with Betty. It's about his ego more than the person in front of him.
Agreed. And Matherton's presence blows that up. And as Matherton departs, Pete mentions that Matherton has the clap to the woman, just to make it clear that he's no prize.
And he walks away with store credit in his name. And that is what Pete got out of this entire exchange.
The next scene has us back in the office with Pete, showing off what he got with his $22 worth of store credit, a .22 caliber bolt-action rifle. He's waving it around, pointing it at people. It just reminds me of the psychiatrist and Dawn are denouncing Betty for her childish behavior, and yet here we see the man-children playing with a firearm in the office, which again is really comical given the history of firearms since 1960 and how this would not be tolerated or happen. But it's a fun time capsule to go back to an age when you could stroll around the office with a .22 rifle.
He's so ill-equipped to handle this. He's wielding it like a toy. And there is a moment where he's aiming it and Peggy comes into his sights just for a minute and there's a pause.
It seems like Pete just takes a lot of childish joy about having his firearm in lieu of the chip and dip. And again, if this is his source of joy as a grown man in the office, I think it points a bit at the pathetic situation Pete finds himself in and where is he seeking his joy and what does it constitute?
And this brings us to our Mad Men from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo double dip question for our listeners for this episode. Some of the real Madison Avenue guys have complained about the depiction of the excessively bad behavior in Mad Men, like the drinking and infidelity, and also that the show misses capturing the so-called creative revolution that advertisers of the time should get credit for. I'll link this in the show notes. There's an article by Andrew Cracknell from 2011, and he also wrote a book called The Real Mad Men, The Renegades of Madison Avenue. So the question is, do you think it does a disservice to the real people of the time period to show so much bad behavior and leave out the credit for the creative movement? Do you think that they have a responsibility to depict the majority when a hit show is teaching viewers about the time period? Or do you think doing whatever is necessary in terms of the service of the story is really all they need to think about? We'd love to hear your insights. You can find us on www.madmenc2z.com. And please let us know. We'd love to discuss your thoughts on a future episode.
Sacrificing historical accuracy and fairness for drama? I'm shocked. Shocked. We next cut to a scene where Roger's with Don, Bert, Harry, Pete, and they're talking about the Nixon campaign. And it's interesting to hear the divide in this conversation because there really does seem to be a break between the generations, where the older folks are leaning towards Nixon and talking about ways in which Nixon can leverage his advantages to beat, the young upstart Kennedy. And in contrast, the younger men talk about some of the appeal, or not directly saying that Kennedy has appeal, but allude to some of his unusual behavior, such as not wearing a hat, as not necessarily being a bad thing. And Pete in particular mentions that Elvis doesn't wear a hat. And in 1960, Elvis is still hugely popular. Bert Cooper comes back with the comment, remind me to stop hiring kids, which just further seems to underline that generational gap between the olds in the office and the youngs.
Roger makes some comment like, now if the adults can weigh in, and Don clocks that. The main point of this is really to throw in some of those signs of the times, the Kennedy-Nixon, Bert insisting that Kennedy is going to be the candidate, reminding us that there was a time when that was unclear. Also to remind us that Roger is getting older and Don notices.
Yeah, and the comment about we don't want a greasy-fingered kid with his finger on the button, referring to Kennedy, is interesting again through modern eyes because Kennedy has never been a kid to the modern audience. He's a historical figure. So it's a fun look back at a time when that older generation is suspicious of Kennedy. And they also mention about him being a Catholic and how Nixon doesn't want to hit Kennedy's Catholicism, which is an interesting comment in hindsight because later it's Nixon's Southern strategy where he ruthlessly goes after racial prejudice in the country as a means of electoral success.
We move into two really quick but very key scenes. As Don comes home, he sees Betty fixing pot roast, and she says, "Hi, honey, I made roast beef. I just cut the strings." And he says, "It's just me tonight, right?" And he glares and he tosses his hat on the table. It's not that Don's infidelity isn't terrible by itself, but his just being extra rude to Betty about Roger's pass at her is a huge twist of the knife. I mean, the hypocrisy of this, of him being upset at Betty when he cheats on her all the time, and it was Roger, not Betty. It's just an awfully petulant moment for Don, who's already a petulant character.
I wonder if Don's own hypocrisy is what's really eating at him.
I hope
And
so.
he set himself up, and that's what's really driving this anger. But ultimately, he realizes he's the one that's disappointed and betrayed this relationship. It also is heartbreaking, I think, in that you see Betty is trying to move on and put it behind them. She's not asking for an apology. She's just trying to get back and behave normally. Again, for the supposed childish character, that seems like a fairly adult way of saying, let's move past this. And yet Don wants to bring it back and cling to it and use it as a club honor whilst being the hypocrite. It's a really brutal scene, but it really rings true to those sort of petty cruelties that we often see in relationships and in the real world, which often don't make it to the screen. But life is full of these types of little situations and incidents. And I think this scene does a masterful job of capturing those in a marriage that is under stress and deteriorating.
It's very powerful. And the next one is too. It cuts immediately to a shot of Pete at his apartment with his rifle across his lap, and we hear Trudy off camera, and she's just, she is incensed. She cannot believe that this is how he spent the money, that her relatives gave them a kind gift. And she says, "You're always telling me to grow up. I can't believe you." And Pete looks miserable. I mean, he was childish and stupid to get a rifle in place of a wedding gift. Here he went from liking to do things for her to just thinking about himself, and now she's berating him for it. He has just lost. There is no win in this situation. At the top of the episode, here he was, a valiant crusading savior, and here he is just this limp, sad figure sitting in the dark.
And you can tell he's just totally feeling sorry for himself. And it's especially hysterical as the next scene kicks off with Pete bringing the gun back to the office because obviously Trudy is not going to have it in her apartment in
And and
Manhattan.
Don passes him and looks, and neither of them says anything. It's just like, "Okay, I guess that's what we're doing now."
Don does pause and has a conversation with the elevator worker and gives him some money, and we're left at that moment to wonder what's going on with that.
Yes, hold that thought.
Wanna-
Peggy brings some files into Pete. He offered to look at her copy. So she said, "I'll take you up on that offer." And she points to the rifle that's now sitting in the corner of his office. And he paints this verbal picture of himself to her of being super masculine. I have to say, nothing about this story is a turn on for me. It is so weirdly specific to think about. He's talking about its back legs and cutting it open and dressing this rabbit. And I understand that it's a fantasy that he's not actually chasing in his real life, but he's so committed to his office upper crust ambitions. It seems very out of place for him to want to hang out in a rustic cabin and handle rabbits.
I think it makes perfect sense that this is Pete's wacky fantasy, because what has he not got in his upper crust connected WASP privileged life? A man's man out on the frontier, in a cabin, hunting his food, killing it, cleaning it. He goes into the detail of all that, carving out a steak from the side of it, bringing it to his woman who cooks it in his cabin. He wipes the knife that he cleaned the animal with on his leg and then eats the cooked meal while his partner watches. It's everything that he doesn't do in his life. It's this sense of what's Pete's masculine ideal? What does he aspire to or dream about? And this seems to be it. Now, I'm with you. It seems a little wacky, but I do think it fits with the character. And as Peggy hears the story, we're sort of left hanging because the story's quite long to wonder what's Peggy's reaction going to be. She says, rather breathlessly, "That would be wonderful." And I'm thinking, it feels like that's honest and legitimate from Peggy, that she is bought into this manly frontier couple story where the woman's, caring and looking after her man after he performs his manly duties to hunt and kill the dinner. Again, it does seem that both characters aspire or at least see some appeal in this fantasy.
Yeah, I really don't get what Peggy sees in this fantasy. I think he says it to her because she's the one he feels like he has power over. But Peggy, you are under no obligation to buy this nonsense. But I do appreciate the humor of her splurging on dessert. She is so turned on by this story. And she's always unassuming with everybody, but she directs the guy at the cart to give her a specific large cherry Danish. I guess if she can't do anything about her attraction, at least she can indulge in her dessert.
I
I
wondered
don't
if
feel it.
I wondered if Peggy had an appetite for a different reason, a biological reason.
100% she does. She's so turned on by this story. She looks at him when he says, "There'd be this woman waiting for me," and she just loves this version of himself. I don't see it, but okay. I also noticed that every episode, Pete pictures himself being something other than what he is, no matter what it is. So maybe being a playboy with Peggy in the first episode when he's about to be married, and being a self-made man who waits to earn the money to afford the apartment, and then being an idea guy like Don, and then being a published writer like Ken, and now a hunter in a cabin. He's really restless about who he is. And in spite of his arrogance, this uncertainty, it doesn't feel like true confidence about what he wants to become. It just feels like he's kind of all over the place about what his idea of being a man really is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. He's very obviously not fulfilled and satisfied with who and what he is. He's thrashing around trying to seize little victories or opportunities to be something else or claim something else. They result in hilarious and punishing failures at every turn. It's very interesting. We've seen so little of Pete to this point, but that theme is probably the strongest theme that comes out of Pete.
And we cut to see Betty shopping in the grocery store with soft music, and she sees Helen Bishop pushing her cart, and she says hello. This interaction does not go as Betty planned. What did you think about this?
I thought Betty was seeking out Helen at that moment to try and be friendly. She's had some bruising interactions with Dawn. Again, I think she's got this inherent curiosity of Helen's situation. And I totally agree with you. She runs into the buzzsaw as Helen confronts her about giving a lock of hair to Glenn. Helen is clearly upset about it, asks why Betty would do that. Betty defends herself by saying that he simply asked for it. Helen asks what is wrong with her. And at that point, Betty slaps Helen in the face in the middle of the store and leaves.
I don't think Betty thinks she did anything wrong, and she can't find anything to say to defend herself. And I think she still pictures herself as somebody who helps Helen and Glenn and pities them. So now that Helen is looking down on her, I think she can't take it. And just like she had to take Dawn's and Roger's bad behavior, she's at her limit. I think she just can't take being scolded or critiqued for another second, and so she snaps.
When I look at that scene and Betty's justification or defense of what she did, I think what Betty's saying there is that she did it in total innocence. She wasn't trying to lead him on or treat him in any non-childlike way. It was an odd request from a child, but she complied with it, and there was no bad intentions on her part. To now have Helen come around and snap at her and insinuate that there were bad intentions, or at least that Betty acted grossly inappropriately, I think that's the source of anger and frustration on Betty's side. She feels wrongfully accused.
When we move into the next scene, on the surface, it feels a little bit lighter and more relaxed. We've got Roger and Dawn having a long lunch together. It seems casual and funny and friendly, but you can feel the tension and the competition lurking underneath. Neither of them wants to be the first to quit feasting or drinking. They're telling jokes and they seem to be having a good time. Roger, especially, you can tell he won the last round. But Dawn, you can see him working. You can see him saying yes to everything. He's on board. He says, I'm on the Roger Sterling diet today. Roger says, I had no idea you were such a fan of the mollusk. And he goes, it's like eating a mermaid. Dawn turning on his poetry here. He does that for clients. He does that to make a sale. So you can see some things at work here.
It does feel, too, that this appetite for destruction is driven by Roger's need to show his masculinity, his manliness. Look at me eating these oysters. Look at us dropping these drinks again and again. He keeps asking Dawn, do you want to keep going? Dawn doesn't drive the next round, but each time he expresses his willingness to keep going, almost goading or prompting Roger to say, well, if you want to keep going, I'm here with you and I'll keep going, which plays perfectly to get Roger to then proceed. They end up ordering cheesecakes for dessert. So they've had this lengthy, booze-filled lunch with oysters and cheesecakes, and now it's wrapping up and they need to head back to the office in order to meet the client.
This fact that Roger says, did you know they serve cheesecake to the Olympic athletes in Greece? That appears to be true. It was a different version of cheesecake than we know today, but in 776 BC, I guess this actually did happen. So here's Roger drinking and pretending to be friends with his younger, good-looking colleague and comparing himself to an Olympian. It really shows his pride. And he wisely advised Dawn not to compete with Pete Campbell in a previous episode. And here he is blatantly competing with Dawn, who he's taken pains to show is beneath him. So it's an interesting choice.
And getting back to the theme about who's being childish here, surely it's the middle-aged man lamenting his lost youth and trying to act younger than he is and impress his younger colleague. Betty's called out and judged, and yet all around this episode, we've got people acting in a very childish manner.
The next scene cuts to Betty at home. She's drinking a glass of wine by herself, so she's day drinking, and Francine, her neighbor, comes over. Francine representing the engine of suburban gossip here. She invents an excuse to stop by with a shirt, but really, we know she's heard about what happened at the market and she wants to get Betty's perspective. So Betty, of course, can't just say, I'm drinking some wine in the middle of the day. She pretends she's hosting a dinner party and she's developing her palate. We have our truth call out happening here because Francine says, Betty, Jill Sandifer was in the market today. Is it true? And again, in Mad Men, this show about advertising an image, we're always looking at what is true and what isn't. Betty doesn't deny it. She doesn't deny that this thing happened. She doesn't offer details, but she says whatever you heard is true, which I think is so interesting. She's not trying to shape the narrative about it, but she doesn't deny it either.
Betty also mentions her mother and talks about how her mother told her, you're a masterpiece, but you need to hide the brushstrokes. You can tell that Betty's contemplating that and how her action in the supermarket plays. She also wonders aloud why she's so vain, mentions that the psychiatrist tried to look down her shirt and that she's earning her keep and keeping up appearances as best she can.
Yes, that was a really interesting, piercingly honest conversation. This thing about you're painting a masterpiece, be sure to hide the brushstrokes. So in other words, don't let people see you work at your presentation of yourself. And then she and Francine both talk about how getting attention from men, Betty feels like when men look at her that way, that's her job, to attract male attention. And at the same time, she doesn't talk about the fact that her boss hit on her and her husband blamed her for it. But that obviously is on her mind. So this whole perception of who she is and what her role is completely wrapped up in her image.
And so much of that image is something that society and others have teed up for her. So I don't get the sense that this necessarily is coming from Betty's own values and desires. It's something that's been served up to her to say, this is what you are, this is how you need to behave and what you need to do. And I think that's at the heart of her dissatisfaction because it is so divergent from where she might have put herself. And yet then there's scores kept about how closely she's adhering to what society and her husband and the psychiatrist think she should or shouldn't be doing. And there's no real concern about Betty the person or what she might want.
And so then she does descend into pettiness because Francine says, well, we're all on your side and we don't have to include Helen Bishop anymore. And she says a few mean things that aren't very substantial about her job or her walking. And Betty joins in and she goes, that John Kennedy, I hate him because, this is all his fault, I guess.
I struggled to understand the John Kennedy comment. Where did that come in? It was because Helen was working on the campaign, I guess, right? So that's
Yes.
the connection between Helen and Kennedy.
And remember that Betty had been looking at Helen, not blatantly looking at Helen as a model of what her life could be, but Helen is going to volunteer on this campaign while Betty babysits. And she said, oh, I'll bring you some literature. And this window here, you can see Betty closing it. I'm not going to look to her. I'm not going to indulge that possibility. I'm going to blame her, much as Dawn blamed Betty. Now Betty will blame Helen, and we just go round and round.
As a viewer, it's a bit of a shame because I think there could be a somewhat natural alliance between Helen and Betty, and now it's been blown up. And as much as people like Francine are part of the neighborhood gossip gang, they're all engaged in the same construct as Betty is, and potentially with greater or lesser degrees of dissatisfaction themselves. So it feels like a door has closed that might have had some real utility for Betty in the future.
The next scene is so epic. Roger and Dawn get back to the office after their lengthy lunch, and Hollis, so surprisingly, it turns out that the elevator is out of service. It's almost like Dawn is not completely surprised by this news.
There's a long sequence of them walking up the floors.
They have to take the stairs now, and it's 23 floors.
And as they go up, we can see Dawn very gently and very subtly prodding Roger. He mentions, oh, you're a Navy man. There's something expected of you as that. He asks if Roger wants to stop and take a rest. Of course, Roger says no. Roger feigns losing his tie clip so he can take a break without having to fess up that he is in fact taking a break. In the end, Roger cuts Dawn loose and says, go on ahead, I'll catch up with you. Obviously, Dawn, just being that much younger than Roger, is able to handle the many flights of stairs. And Dawn has now contrived to present this limitation of Roger and really draw a line here to say, you're older and you can't physically keep up with me. And now Roger's paying the price.
They're competing as they climb the stairs just as much as they competed to drink and eat too much at the restaurant. Nobody is going to quit. They said in the DVD commentary that they had 4 real flights of stairs and they had to keep running down and then climbing back up, and then they would change the signs to show what floor they were on. The competition here, it seems realistic to me. Do you feel like this is realistic between 2 men who just won't admit that neither one will say that they're tired?
I think so. And again, it gets back to the childishness theme, right? It's like, why is the middle-aged man trying to keep up with the young man? It's all to do with ego and pride and vanity.
It's a great detail that when Don gets to the top, he puts his hands on his knees and he coughs and he smooths his hair before he goes into the office. So we see that this climb was not easy for him. His advantage is just genetics and time. So he's playing that card because he can, just like Roger has his name on the building and that was his luck. So there will come a day when younger men than Don will run up the stairs and he'll be panting too hard to go on. But today is not that day.
The scene then cuts to the Nixon team is in the Cooper Sterling offices. As they're making those initial introductions, Roger staggers into the office looking like death warmed over. No sooner do the introduction of Roger commence when Roger vomits, and we can imagine cheesecake and oysters and all the booze. It's a total disaster all over the carpet. Everybody backs away, and it's incredibly gross and embarrassing for Roger. He staggers back and sits down.
I noticed the execs aren't even that bothered by the display. Of course, it's not Roger's best moment, but one of them says, "Well, I'm sorry I missed this lunch." It feels like the account situation hasn't changed so much. It's more about Roger's personal humiliation. He's sitting down, sweating through his suit as Dawn stands over him.
Agreed. It's a total victory for Dawn in this little competition. You don't get the sense that the Nixon guys are especially put out or horrified, although, it's embarrassing. Now Roger's gone from being strong and dominant to everybody asking him, is he okay? What can they get for him? It's total defeat for Roger. Father Time 1, Roger Sterling 0.
The closing song is this up-tempo one called Bachami, performed by Rosemary Clooney. It was popular in 1952. And the lyrics mean kiss me. And they also sort of underscore this tit-for-tat feeling because it says, like, you squeeze me and I'll squeeze you. So this up-tempo song fits with Don's momentary victory. He gives Roger a fake supportive pat on the arm and he walks away with a smirk. Don has had some pretty awful moments. Do you feel triumphant over his win over Roger in this scene, or do you feel sorry for Roger? What's your take?
I don't have pity for either, so I just think it's a competition and one prevailed in a rather humorous way. I don't find myself siding with Don's triumph here, especially seeing the hypocrisy he had with his wife earlier in the episode. So again, it gets back to almost a boys will be boys. And okay, in this round, boy A won, boy B lost. The shoe will be on the other foot soon enough.
That's it for this episode, Red in the Face. We hope you'll share our podcast with other Mad Men fans and leave us some positive reviews, and catch us next time for the breakdown of Mad Men Season 1, Episode 8, The Hobo Code.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctozee.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.